So I'm in Eclipse now. Because web service is deployed like a web application in a web container like Apache Tomcat, so it also has got a web.xml or deployment descriptor file, just like a web application has. So I can use web.xml to load Spring. I will just show you how. I go to web app folder, and within that there is a web.xml. This is a blank file, and now to save time I'm not going to add elements in this live demo, but I'm copying it from my existing web service that I have created it in another workspace. Here you go. So as we talked earlier, CXF uses Spring to provide XML configuration of services. So we need to load Spring via servlet listener and tell it where our XML configuration file is. In our case, we are putting configuration file named soapservice.xml inside webinf. Soapservice.xml will be specific for the SOAP web service, and similarly we will be adding REST service.xml for the REST web service here in the context param. And we can have both the files within the param value separated by space, and space will be considered as a delimiter, and CXF will look for both the files to configure the endpoints. Because initially we will be developing SOAP web services, so I'm removing REST service.xml from the configuration at this point, and I will add it later when we develop a REST web service. So here is the Spring's listener class, and this is the context parameter that we are passing to the listener to load. Next, we need to add CXF servlet in web.xml, and this servlet will handle all requests to our web service. And we have marked it to load on startup of the server by marking load on startup as 1. Next, we see here that the servlet mapping we are specifying here is /services as the URL pattern, so that all requests to /services URL go to the CXF servlet. So by now we have created all parts of our web service, all the Java classes of our web services, and also configured the location of CXF configuration file or endpoint configuration file soapservice.xml in the deployment descriptor web.xml. So now one final activity is required, creating that CXF endpoint configuration file soapservice.xml, and I am going to create that in this demo now. So I go to web.xml, new file, soapservice.xml. This is a Spring configuration file, so I'll be using typical Spring configuration for this. And in the benefit of time, I'm not creating each element in this live demo, but just like before, I'm copying the contents from the web service that I have created in another Eclipse workspace and pasting it here. Path to various CXF schema files being specified here, and we see the location of cxf.xml file being specified and imported in this configuration file. cxf.xml, as I mentioned earlier, is part of one of the jars of CXF. So as the CXF bus creates many CXF services, we can choose and decide which ones are the ones that we want to use for our application. And here I am adding CXF logging that will help log the incoming and outgoing SOAP messages. And now we are at the endpoint configuration part of this XML. There are many attributes to endpoint element, and the primary ones are address, which is the publish address of the web service, and the implementer. So the implementer attribute of JAX-WS endpoint element has the value of the service implementer class, which in our case was date time zone service impl. We give an ID to this element and then provide the value to implementer attribute, the fully qualified name of the class. And this is the address at which our web service will be published. Then we have a features element or sub element of JAX-WS endpoint element, and using this we can add many capabilities to a server, a client, or a bus. For example, we could add ability to log messages for each of these objects by configuring them with a logging feature. Now I am adding interceptors here. As we talked about interceptors already while creating interceptors, here I am going to configure my interceptor as a in interceptor. JAX-WS in interceptors is used to add interceptors to the interceptor chain by adding it to the inbound interceptor provider. So you see that I have declared the bean as in interceptor, give it an ID of in interceptor, and using that as a ref bean within the JAX-WS in interceptor sub-element. Now I also, because I am using security, I need to add the interceptor for the WSS4J, so that all requests that come to this web service go through the validator class. We can declare properties here as name value. For example, I am enabling mtom here and then disabling message validation against the schema with a value of false to the property name schema validation enabled, and giving the value to the validator property as service username token validator. And we see here that the service name token validator has the ID for our class that we created for validating username and password, service username token validator. So in this lecture, we looked at how to configure CXF servlet and endpoint configuration within different XML files. So now we are at the end of this lecture. Here is an exercise for you. So for the vehicle details web service that you added as part of the exercise in the earlier lecture, add the required configuration to web.xml and create a new endpoint configuration file with the name vehicle reg soap service.xml. So folks, bye for now and look forward to see you in the next lecture.